Hi, everyone, and welcome to RemTech's Risk Assessment and Management Technical Session. Thank you for choosing this session. My name is Sheila Dutchik. I am a hydrogeologist with S&C Lavalin. I'm also a board member for ESAW, and I'd like to start off with a message from our sponsor. You for that video. That's awesome. So our first speaker is Jennifer Mayberry from Steer Environmental, and her presentation is the case for risk assessment as the remedial option of choice. And I'll switch my view and take it away, Jen.
Thank you. Can you see my presentation okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hello? Okay, good. Good afternoon, I guess, everybody. I am Jen Mayberry. I'm with Steer Environmental here in lovely Nelson, BC. I am here today to plead the case for risk assessment as the remedial option of choice. I have been working in contaminated sites for a little over 20 years now. I've worked as a consultant, as a landowner's representative, in a regulatory capacity. And I think that so I've been able to see risk assessment from various perspectives. And I think it is an underappreciated and underutilized form of remediation. I think it is often used as sort of a last ditch Hail Mary, as opposed to being the first tool out of the toolbox. And I think there's the result of that is a lost opportunity. So today I'm hoping to convert the unconverted, although this being the risk assessment stream, I'm not sure how many of you are not risk assessors, because this presentation is geared towards those that are not. But I'm hoping to kind of get everybody to take a step back and to convince you to take a look at contaminated sites management from a life cycle perspective, to see its cradle to grave impact on an ecosystem. There we go. Okay, so I am hoping to do this by giving you a brief overview of risk assessment. I think one of the biggest challenges with risk assessment is that it's not well understood. I'm going to hope to kind of demystify some of that for you by giving the overview and also walking you through a case study for a site that is sort of a prime candidate for risk assessment. Talk a little bit about how, why, and when risk assessment is the best option, in my opinion. Talk about some of the advantages and opportunities that risk assessment provides, and then some kind of considerations for site investigators, risk assessors, and regulators. So when we look at a contaminated site, the presence of contamination alone does not equal risk. Risk assessment evaluates the potential for adverse effects. So this classic Venn diagram kind of shows you what we need in order for there to be risk. There need to be contaminants present, receptors present, and then operable exposure pathways between those contaminants and those receptors. So in risk assessment, particularly in the problem formulation, the first stage, we identify the potential contaminants of concern specific to those receptors, as well as the receptors, and then we look at what are potential exposure pathways between the two. So risk assessment is science-based and very conservative. Each risk assessment is unique to the site for which it was prepared. And risk assessment uses mathematical models to predict the dose that a receptor could be exposed to through various exposure pathways. And then it adds up all those doses and compares them to a dose of that substance which is considered to be safe, which has been determined through toxicological research. And more often than not, the tox data that we use in risk assessment is more current and potentially more accurate than the data that was used to develop the remediation standards to which we're all working. So when we do these calculations for human health, we do them for cancer and non-cancer risks. And this approach has been used widely by the EPA since the 1980s and in BC since 1987. Now, in my opinion, the role of science is to inform, not to make decisions. And the EPA risk characterization policy says that scientific uncertainty is a fact of life. A balanced discussion of reliable conclusions and related uncertainties enhances rather than detracts from the overall credibility of each assessment. So to this point, good risk assessment has to be useful for the purposes for which it was intended. It has to be understandable, and it has to be complete, informative, and useful to decision makers. And I'll talk about how we can ensure that these things happen a little bit. So risk assessment is used really commonly across Canada, the US, and Europe as a form of remediation. I know some jurisdictions within Canada don't allow it for closure, and it's used as sort of a screening tool. But I think, again, there's a lot of lost opportunity there. So in BC, the way our regulatory system works is that there are two paths to compliance. There is the numeric path, where you physically remediate a site to the standards, the applicable standards under the Contaminated Sites Regulation. And the end goal or result is a certificate of compliance from the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. The alternative is to do a site-specific risk assessment, which evaluates the risk to current and potential or known future receptors on that site and for the specific land uses. And if you are able to demonstrate that risk is acceptable, you are able to attain what's called a risk-based CFC. Now, there are prerequisites to even attempting risk assessment when you're looking for closure like that. One is that all contamination needs to be delineated. The site investigators need to demonstrate that all of the contamination is stable or decreasing in concentration and extent. And there are specific requirements around the type of monitoring and the amount of monitoring that is required before you can say, yes, we can provide assertion that it's stable or decreasing. In the development and use of sustainability criteria in the SURF UK Sustainable Remediation Framework, Bardos et al. Said, the international consensus is that risk-based land management provides the best available framework for decisions because it provides an objective way to link actions to the prevention of harm. It provides a rationale for how to intervene, and it provides a rationale to prioritize limited resources at the most serious or problem sites. Now, to me, when we think about land remediation and when we evaluate our options, I think the most important lens for us in this day and time to look at these things is through the lens of sustainable development. I'm sure everybody watching this presentation knows that the definition of sustainable development is, meeting our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. And this is a classic Venn diagram that demonstrates that, with the three pillars of sustainable development being environment, social, and economic. And I think when we look at these three pillars of sustainable development, risk assessment ticks off the boxes in all three of these categories. And physical remediation kind of does the opposite. That's where this sounds a bit funny. When we look at the three pillars, the environmental component needs to consider the wider life cycle impacts of physical remediation. And so when we're talking about that, we're thinking about fuel and electricity consumption and greenhouse gas emissions associated with mob and demob to a site, the use of equipment on site, the transportation of soil from a site to a disposal or a treatment facility. We think about the use of chemicals in some forms of remediation, the soil and vegetation disturbance, and I think something like 9 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are tied to soil management and maintenance, and then waste generation. And of course, the big part of this is the space taken up in landfills by contaminated soil. From an economic perspective, on average, risk assessment costs about 75% less than physical remediation of sites. And you are also, the kind of the standard is if you could take 20% of your remediation costs to remove the source and then risk assess the residual, there's a huge opportunity to be had there. And that is something that a risk assessor will happily work with you on, is you can hand over a data set and say, how much of this can we risk assess and how much do we have to remove in order for the risk to be acceptable? And then socially, I mean, there are things such as, reduced travel in pandemic times. It's an awful lot easier to do a risk assessment from my desk than to try to get people up into the field in the middle of a pandemic. But more importantly, I think we need to reconsider or reframe liability and how we see liability as it ties to contaminated sites. I mean, to me, if you can conservatively assess the risk to current and future land use at a site, and there is no risk or the risk is acceptable, then so too should the liability be. And I also think that when you think about it, physical remediation doesn't really remove any liability. You're just relocating it to another facility. So risk assessment has way more applications than I think I currently see it used. I know it's really commonly used to address inaccessible contamination. For example, like a plume has gone under the one corner of the building and you can't physically remediate it, but it has many more applications and many more opportunities for use. It can be done in accordance with federal and provincial or territorial regulatory regimes. It's a slam dunk at a lot of remote sites where you can combine engineering with toxicology, or when you know that you have no receptors and therefore there are no exposure pathways. On a site when the cost to physically remediate is higher than the land value, you can make conservative assumptions about the future land use and risk assess that way. On sites where matrix standards don't reflect the actual conceptual exposure model. So for example, in BC, where drinking water standards apply across the site unless you can demonstrate that from a hydrogeological perspective, a viable groundwater well could not be installed. If you can go into the risk assessment and determine it's a remote site, it's probably never going to be developed, nobody's there, we're safe to conclude that the drinking water exposure pathway is inoperable. And then you can apply less stringent standards to the site and risk assess it that way. When you have restrictions to site access from things like COVID or seasonal concerns. And then lastly, from a sustainability and carbon intensity perspective, when that is a concern or a goal for your organization or your client, risk assessment is a huge opportunity. So to demonstrate this and hopefully, demonstrate the risk assessment process and the scientific basis on which it is done, I'm going to walk you through a case study for a site that we worked on for a remote, it's a remote site. It was a former well location. Contamination was comprised of salt, metals, and petroleum hydrocarbons in soil, as well as petroleum hydrocarbons in groundwater. The contamination was attributed to a below ground leak, either from the well or for some buried piping. And the approximate area impacted was 4,800 square meters. So the first thing we do is we screen the contaminants of potential concern by receptor. So we look at human health, we look at terrestrial ecological and aquatic ecological. And when we screen these contaminants of potential concern against the standards that apply to those specific receptors, we end up screening out all of the soil contaminants and groundwater contaminants for human health and identified no COPCs for human health. For terrestrial ecological, we identified VPH and a couple other parameters as contaminants in surface soil and subsurface soil. And for aquatic ecological, we screened in VPH and LEPH in groundwater. No soil vapor contamination or sediment or surface water contamination was identified on site. So when we think about receptors, that's the next step. We look at the site, we know it's 18 kilometers from the nearest town. There's no redevelopment plan for the site or anywhere near it. It is expected to continue to evolve into a wildland state. So really our human receptors are recreators. We're thinking about hikers, anglers, hunters. Terrestrial ecological receptors we're looking at soil invertebrates, plants, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles. And when we do this, we do a screening as well for species at risk and for known receptors in the area. Aquatic ecological, we're looking at invertebrates, vegetation, fish, aquatic birds and animals, mammals in the nearby river and lake. So then the next step is to evaluate our potential exposure pathways. So for humans, we didn't identify any COPCs for human health. We know there's no current wells in the surrounding area. We know there's no planned future drinking water use. And so we determined that there are no operable exposure pathways for current or future use. When we look at the terrestrial ecological receptors, we know that soil invertebrates are exposed to surface soil, particularly upper half meter of soil. And when I say surface soil, I mean the top meter of soil. We knew that there were deep rooting plants on the site, but we also know that 83% of the root biomass occurs in the upper 30 centimeters on a site in this forest biome. So we were able to conclude that or assume that all root exposure at the site was expected to occur in the top meter of soil. We know the burrowing animals are unlikely to burrow any deeper than 1 meter. So we know that our operable exposure pathways exist from surface soil to our soil invertebrates, our plants, and our wildlife. We ruled out exposure for wildlife through ingestion of vegetation and prey. We decided that was of minor significance because the COPCs that we were dealing with, VPH, don't bioaccumulate and they don't biomagnify. Then we looked at aquatic ecological receptors. We know that groundwater has been sufficiently delineated. We know that contamination is stable or decreasing in concentration or extent. We know from analysis that there was no impact to water quality in the nearby river or lake. We know that the sediment was similarly not affected. We also took a look at it and modeled and determined that the river was not expected to erode into the impacted areas of the site. Therefore, we were able to conclude that there were no operable exposure pathways for aquatic life for the current or future uses of the site. So then we come to our conceptual exposure model, and this is what you develop at the end of your problem formulation to decide who do we need to carry forward and assess the risk to. So you can see from this, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, but this shows you where the residual soil contamination is, where the residual groundwater contamination is, where we have operable exposure pathways to our soil invertebrates, plants, and wildlife, and where they are inoperable, so to people, and then also from subsurface soil and to our aquatic life. So the next step in the risk assessment is to do the exposure assessment. And we do this by a statistical analysis of the VPH concentrations we have in surface soil. And we apply the 90th percentile as the exposure point concentration for immobile receptors like soil invertebrates and plants. We use the 95 UCLM as the EPC for wildlife because they're mobile and they can be expected to average their exposure to contaminants in soil over space and time. So then we come to the effects assessment, and this is where we have to identify the appropriate toxicity reference values for our receptors. Now, when the site was in BC and under the BC CSR, the standard for VPH is generic. But we know that Alberta Environment Parks has a soil quality guideline for the protection of soil invertebrate and plants by direct contact, and also for wildlife through soil and food ingestion. So these soil quality guidelines were selected as our TRVs for this project. Then we come to the risk characterization, and this is where we integrate the findings of the exposure and the effects assessment, and where we determine the likelihood of adverse effects from the contamination. And this is done sort of in 3 steps. So the first is the risk estimation, where we calculate the hazard quotient for our receptors. Then we analyze our uncertainties, and then we kind of tie it all together in a risk description, having considered those 2 previous components. In risk characterization, the HQs that we calculated for soil invertebrates, plants, and wildlife were less than 1, which indicates a negligible and acceptable risk. The uncertainties the uncertainties that we looked at included adequate site characterization, which we determined to be appropriate, appropriate EPC selection, which was very conservative and likely overestimated exposure, contaminant availability, which was conservative as toxicological studies use highly bioavailable chemical formulations, and the TRV selection, which again was receptor and exposure pathway specific, so protective and conservative. So at the end of this, our risk description was that the risk to all ecological receptors was low and acceptable. So I think this demonstrates, I hope this demonstrates, that risk assessment is science-based, it's conservative, but it's also practical. So some of the advantage and opportunities that I see for risk assessment, and I'm going to repeat a couple of these, but I think they're worth repeating. On remote sites where contamination can be managed in place with no risk to human or ecological receptors. When you have a remote site with contamination at depth and you know it's stable or decreasing, that's a slam dunk. On a site where the land value is less than physical remediation, and again, when site access is restricted or difficult, risk assessment should be the first tool out of the box to say, can we use risk assessment to manage this contamination? I think also a really important consideration is that if you are able to use risk assessment more often, which is a less costly approach to physical remediation, you can address and potentially close way more sites and much faster. So that should be a consideration for landowners as well. Now, class level risk assessment, I think, is a really interesting option for similar sites. And this is where it's great for remote sites too, but this is where you take the traditional risk assessment approach and you apply it to a subset of similar sites. So former well sites, for example, or dew lines or airports or fuel storage facilities. And you assess the risk and you sort of extend that risk across all those sites. And this can be a really valuable tool to target your highest risk sites and to prioritize your remediation efforts or your risk management efforts going forward. Something I mentioned before that I think is a great opportunity for people to consider is source removal plus risk assessment. So again, if you go to your risk assessor and you say, here's our data set, how much of it do we have to remove? How much of it can we manage in place? This is a huge opportunity to decrease your costs, to decrease your liability. And also with the majority of the contaminants that we're dealing with, especially on oil and gas sites, we know that natural attenuation is going to occur with those residual pieces that are left as well. So that's something to consider. And lastly, again, to achieve and support corporate sustainability goals, using risk assessment as a form of remediation gives a potential for huge decreases in GHG emissions, decreases in waste production, and the overall environmental footprint. So I think when we are evaluating our remediation options, it's really important to consider the life cycle impact of a contaminated site and not to just target the fastest and most direct path to closure. So I have a couple of kind of considerations or tips for the various teams that I mentioned, the site investigators, the risk assessors, and regulators. I think early involvement of risk assessors can result in significant time and cost efficiencies. If you involve your risk assessor early in your project planning, they can help with your remediation planning. They can also, if they are involved early on, they can tell you exactly what data is going to be needed from the field, and that can minimize the number of trips required to the field to collect that data. You can ask your risk assessors for a site-specific cost estimate to, again, inform your decision-making processes when trying to decide the path forward in managing your contaminated sites. I think it's really important to ensure that risk assessors understand project goals so that the risk assessment is adequate, robust, and valuable for decision-making. It's very common as a risk assessor to just have a data set thrown over the fence to you, and then the client waits for a pass or fail. And if you're not able to kind of see the bigger picture, you're not able to maybe help work with them and inform their decision-making processes, or help to support that process as well. And then lastly, which I mentioned as well, is to consider the environmental fate of your chemicals. So the majority of cases, you can't assume that the concentrations we're measuring today are going to exist in perpetuity. So again, when we look at that source removal and risk assessing the residual, we have to consider what that's going to look like down the road. For risk assessors, I think that many people see risk assessment as highly technical and difficult to access or to understand. And I assure you, if I can do that, it's not rocket science. But risk assessors need to be better at informing their colleagues and their clients and their stakeholders about the process of risk assessment, so that those colleagues and stakeholders can better understand the process and have more confidence in its conclusions and recommendations. And also so that they can identify opportunities for future implementation of risk assessment on the sites they're dealing with. And lastly, for regulators, I think regulators need to take a step back and see the big picture when they're considering, remediation options and what they're willing to accept for closure. I think it's really important to be pragmatic, especially when we're dealing with remote sites where we're almost certain is never going to be developed, or no one's ever going to install a drinking water well. We need to be pragmatic in that, and especially when we're thinking about our future land use. We need to allow for assumptions, for informed assumptions, for conservative assumptions. But again, there's always going to be a little bit of uncertainty, and we've got to kind of trust the experts that they're making conservative decisions in this area. And then lastly, I think it's important for everybody just to weigh the environmental, social, and economic benefits when you're evaluating your remediation options, because risk assessment has or can provide many of those benefits. And that's it. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or you can reach me at this contact information.
So I'm not seeing any questions on my chat panel. It is possible, Jen, that you're in presenter mode, and so it's on your screen.
I don't see any either, but again, I've never presented in GoToWebinar, so I don't.
Okay.
No, I don't see anything.
I'm gonna make myself presenter. Yeah, I don't see any questions. Okay.
That gives you a couple minutes to spare then. Oh, okay.
I do have one. one person has said risk assessment used to optimize remediation or even show that remediation is not necessary. So that person wrote that at 1:42. I'm not sure if that was a specific time in your presentation with respect to a specific slide. And a
I don't
definition
know.
of remediation in Alberta is that removal and deconstruction of contaminants. That was from one of our regulatory friends. So not really any questions, but I have found the question
Okay.
panel. And so if there are any further questions, otherwise, I'm going to suggest that we say goodbye to Jennifer, and we'll just maybe we can go and get our next presenter queued up, presentation ready, and that sort of thing, and we'll start right at 2 o'clock.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. All right, Bart and Karen, just want to make sure you guys are ready to go. I've made you a presenter.
Yeah, I think we're ready. Karen and I are both in different locations, so I think she's going to handle, the
Excellent.
slides.
Okay, let's wait 2 minutes because there are people switching back and forth between sessions.
Okay. Karen, are you able to do that? Can you take control of the slides?
Oh no,
I've got to do it.
hang on, let me see.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sheila?
Try that, Karen. I've
Show my
switched you.
screen? Okay.
Perfect.
Is that good? Can you see it?
I
Yep.
sure can.
Okay.
Now we are seeing your notes panel, just so you know, Karen.
Oh, okay. How do I turn that off? Sorry. I've never used GoToWebinar before.
Logan, are you on?
Display settings.
Right here.
I think that's it, yeah.
That one? Hey, there we go.
Yeah, right on.
Thanks, Logan, even though we didn't need you.
Well, I know you're there.
Yes, we know you're there and we appreciate it. All right. So on my computer, looks like we are at time. So I'd like to invite our second speaker to discuss it. It's Bart Kopp and Karen Phillips with Intrinsic. And the topic that they'll be discussing today is a human health risk assessment conundrum. What is the best way to evaluate short-term exposures at contaminated sites? And take it away, Karen.
Okay, well, hello, RemTech. I have to admit this is quite different. I know it's RemTech time because the leaves are falling and changing color and it's snowy and I can't find my snow brush. So it's about right for October. It's great to be able to participate. So Bart and I are excited to be able to do this. So I'm Karen. I'm a risk assessor within Intrinsic, and a lot of the ABT and the ERT means that I'm a board certified toxicologist. Bart is our vice president, Canadian Environmental Group, and has been with Intrinsic Cantox for over 20 years now. We're both broadcasting live from the Intrinsic office in downtown Calgary, but in our respective offices to obey social distancing. So let me take you through our presentation today. I hope to provide you with an overview of the issue, some general toxicological concepts and why they're important to what we're going to speak about today. Bart will then walk you through some potential pitfalls and case study type information, and I'll close up again with parting thoughts. The assessment of acute and short-term risks is a requirement in Alberta under our existing Tier 2 guidance, and it's also mentioned in the supplemental site-specific risk assessment guidance document that was issued in draft earlier this year, where there's a clear requirement going to be required for the assessment of acute and subchronic risks. And I'll get into the definitions of those in a couple slides ahead. In addition to the conventional assessment, which is looking at long-term risks to potential health. So you're like, okay, Karen, why is this even a topic? Well, it's a challenge because a lot of the information that's out there with respect to toxicity limits, or what are considered to be safe levels of exposure, are generally aimed at either acute inhalation or chronic ingestion. So chronic soil ingestion, chronic water ingestion, where there's long-term exposure to the different chemicals. And the toxicological assessment of shorter term effects can be quite different, and it really depends on the chemical, which I hope to highlight to you today. And a lot of the existing guidelines that we have, in fact, most of them, for when I mean guidelines or criteria, I'm referring to the Alberta Tier 1, the Canadian Drinking Water Quality Guidelines, the Canadian Council for Ministers of the Environment, Environmental Quality Guidelines, and other those in other jurisdictions. They're conventionally based on long-term exposures, so exposures that are a number of months or years. And on the left, I have a diagram, which is the conventional risk assessment paradigm. And Jennifer in the slide ahead of us, or the presentation ahead of us, did talk a little bit about some of the steps of risk assessments and the relative importance, which was quite nice. These two presentations go well together. And when I'm talking about toxicity limits, I'm really looking at that second row in this paradigm on the box on the right, where it says toxicity assessment. And you take the values that you determine in this step, you pair it with an exposure estimate, and with those two things combined, you estimate a potential risk to the people or group of people and the different types of pathways of exposure that you've identified for your project. And those risk characterization estimates are important because they then can determine risk management options for a particular site or a particular building or operation. It could also affect site liability in future. Why do duration and frequency matter? Because when you start looking at short-term versus long-term, acute versus chronic, you're really talking about differences in duration and differences in frequency. So how often within those periods of time a person could be exposed to a chemical also matters. And for contaminated sites, a lot of our guidance is quite generic, where we're looking at default exposure assumptions. So a certain number of hours per day, days per year. And those may or may not be relevant to the chemical you're looking at, or even the exposure scenario you're looking at. For things like an accidental release or an exposure that a contractor or a site remediation specialist might get while they're on site might be quite different than what a resident would get who could be living there on a day-to-day basis and being regularly exposed. Those types of assessments take different types of toxicity limits, or they should, because they're quite different in terms of the overall duration and how often a person could be exposed. And risks can be over or underestimated depending on the approaches that you use. And this can have a pretty notable effect on the development of remediation targets and risk management decisions. So when I'm talking about acute, chronic, I'm tossing these terms around, what do they mean? Well, the general difference between them is that an acute exposure is generally, but not always, considered to be a single or one-time exposure of a relatively short duration. An intermediate exposure, or often used, you hear the term subchronic used to describe this, it's a repeated exposure for some duration that's more than a single exposure, but less than a long-term exposure. And chronic is a repeated long-term exposure, sometimes over the lifetime. Now, these terms come out, or the way that I'm using them right now, relate to how in the underlying study underneath the guideline that's been developed for a particular chemical, there's there's a study. So it could be animals, it could be humans. They're exposed for a certain amount of time. They're exposed under certain conditions at certain frequencies. And based on all of those factors together, help determine whether it's acute, intermediate, or chronic. But the exposure time, when you're starting to look at contaminated sites where the people might be exposed, you have to consider those together along with what's in the underlying basis of that scientific toxicity reference value and find some relationship between the two. So because it's quite complex, you'd think that there's some consistency or clear guidance out there on what these definitions mean and from the different jurisdictions. But as you can see from the table that I have in this slide, it's quite variable, and it really depends on the jurisdiction that you're in. So when you're doing a contaminated site assessment on something that's considered to be acute or chronic or even intermediate, you need to be paying attention to what the definition is so that you're choosing your toxicity reference values accordingly, and then also going to evaluate your exposure in a way that's harmonious, what you've chosen for the toxicity limit. So for Alberta environment, their guidance right now suggests less than 24-hour exposure is acute, and greater than 30 days is intermediate, and then repeated long-term is more general. For Health Canada, it's less than 14 days, and then 14 to 90 days for intermediate, subchronic, and greater than 90 days. And if you look across these columns, you see that there's some variability when you go up and down. So sometimes it's less than 24 hours, and other times it's less than 14 days for other agencies for acute. For intermediate, it's quite a range from anywhere from greater than 14 up to 364 days could be considered subchronic. And then chronic, again, could be quite different from 3 months to 6 months to 365 days. So it's important to pay attention to the regulatory jurisdiction. And why is this so complicated? Look, why can't there be a common term for everything? And the reason why is because it's quite chemical specific. It'd be very challenging for a regulatory organization to make a definition that would be equally applicable to all kinds of different chemicals. And it really comes down to proper decision making by the risk assessment team and the regulators that are deriving the values. So what the importance of chemical specific information, I mean, is the effect of the chemical concentration dependent? Is it time dependent? Is it a function of both time and concentration? Some chemical effects, their key effects could be only relevant to an in utero exposure in a developing child, but maybe less relevant to a construction worker who's an adult. There could be some exposure pathways where the chemical is more toxic, and then it's less toxic by inhalation versus oral. Some chemicals have a very specific target window of susceptibility. You think it's thalidomide, its toxicity effects, even though it was a pharmaceutical, was an early phase of pregnancy on the developing fetus. But for an adult, the effects were quite different. So the window susceptibility of a developmental process can be quite variable. The toxicity of a chemical can really change by how much is absorbed, whether metabolites are formed that are more active than the original chemical, and then how quickly the chemical and its metabolites are eliminated, because a chemical that's more persistent and remains in the body longer could elicit its effect longer. And if you have a few intermediate, even if they're short-term exposures, that chemical can persist in the blood, and it could mean that you're actually looking at more of a subchronic intermediate exposure as opposed to an acute, and that makes a difference on your exposure calculation as well as your toxicity value. It's also important to consider the nature of the effect, whether it's carcinogenic or non-carcinogenic, mutagenic, non-mutagenic, genotoxic, non-genotoxic. The reason why is because most physiological systems have an adaptation process. They also have a repair process, and once those become overwhelmed, it takes time, but they can become overwhelmed, and then you can have some sort of non-alterable change that can occur with a chronic exposure. Those are less applicable to acute, but even that rule is not totally across the board, because a developmental exposure to a developing fetus, it could take only one exposure in theory. So chemical specific information is key to a quality TRV. I want you to get that in your head, because that's my one of my mantras for this presentation. So for a complicated topic, what guidance is available? Well, the answer is not much right now, because it's quite an emerging area, because it is so complicated. Health Canada issued a guidance memo in 2016, and they are currently following that up with some supplemental guidance that's supposed to come out later this year or next year. And it's more of a decision tree format. which is interesting because it is so complex, and it does take into consideration different types of exposure scenarios and as well as different types of chemical specific features. So it helps guide you through to selecting the right approach. There's limited guidance available from other agencies beyond having some acute, intermediate, or chronic toxicity reference values. There isn't a lot of clear guidance. And because of this lack of clear guidance at this point, there's an inconsistency approaches that are being used by site assessors, by regulators, and people who are relying upon these assessments and guidelines for estimating remediation targets or making risk management decisions. And because there's such inconsistencies, it opens it up for potential inaccuracies. And depending on the level of expertise of the practitioner and the quality of the information that's available to them with respect to the chemicals on site. Other complicating factors that aren't unique to just short-term exposures or acute exposures, but are certainly relevant to contaminated sites that you have to consider because they can have influence on your acute exposure estimate or your short-term exposure estimate is the exposure regular or daily? Is the exposure occasional or is it intermittent, like a person that could come and do landscaping work a couple times a week on a site that perhaps has some contamination? How would you estimate their exposure? What do you know about the chemical? Is that contamination present at the surface or at the subsurface? Is it something that's only relevant to a site worker that would be excavating soil with lots of PPE in place and risk management procedures, or is it a child that could be playing? It's important to have realistic exposure parameters, and for contaminated sites, a common one that comes into play is soil ingestion. Are the representative estimates that you're using for your assessment, are they based on a longer term average exposure, or are they applicable to a short term or acute exposure? Are they applicable to the type of person that you're looking at? I have a note here about pica children. And pica is a medical condition where there's compulsive ingestion of non-food items for a period of greater than a month. And it's usually diagnosed in people greater than 2 years of age. So you can see it in children. And there's a requirement in the Alberta Tier 2 to have a guideline check value when you're deriving your site-specific value to consider a pica child. But then it becomes challenging because then are you looking at an acute exposure or are you looking at chronic? Is it best evaluated as a short-term with a short-term TRV and then a short-term exposure estimates or a longer-term scenario? It really depends on the scenario that you're in and your communications with the regulator. And there can always be potential susceptible subpopulations on any contaminated site that you need to factor in. So can short-term effects be assessed? And my question to you is, do you have all the information that you need? Do you have TRVs, toxicity reference values of the right duration for your site and for the different scenarios? Is your toxicological endpoint relevant to acute? Do you understand how the chemical lists effects on living systems? Is it short-term, long-term? Is it concentration or time dependent for both? Is your endpoint relative to your receptor? So back to that example again, is it a in utero developing fetus type endpoint that's very unique? And then are you trying to apply that to an adult site worker that's exposed occasionally? You need to take those kind of things into consideration. As I mentioned before, the substance half-life is important to understand how long it may remain in the body and how long it may elicit its effects. And then the last 2 points kind of go hand in hand. Do you have the right information to develop the most defensible exposure calculations for your assessment? And now I'm going to pass the speaking to Bart Koppa, who's our Vice President of Environment here in Calgary, and he is going to give you a few case studies and common pitfall examples.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, so I guess the first question you'd want to ask is, if the chronic risks are okay for a contaminated site, why do we even bother? Why do we bother looking at acute exposures or short-term exposures? I guess the short answer here in Alberta is that there is a pretty clear regulatory requirement in the Alberta Tier 2 Soil and Groundwater Remediation Guidelines of 2019. There's a statement that indicates that for all human health risk assessments, risk from acute pica or pica events should be evaluated to determine that the assessment is protective of these events. So a detailed human health risk assessment has to at least consider this scenario. Now, it may seem counterintuitive because generally, you think, well, if everything's okay on the chronic side of things, they ought to be fine on the acute side of things, but that's not always the case. And I'll touch on this a little bit later on. So I'll provide you with a couple of examples, just to highlight what some of the challenges that risk assessors and site managers can be faced with when they are assessing short-term risks at contaminated sites. So I'll present 3 examples, but by no means is this list of examples exhaustive when describing some of the potential pitfalls. And then I'll end with a couple of case studies. So this is kind of, things that we've seen or come across over the years when we look at site assessors or risk assessors trying to assess potential short-term health risks. And then as well, again, like I said, I'll touch on 2 case examples that were recently presented in the UK. Okay, next slide, please, Karen. Thanks. So the first example relates to kind of an incorrect use of a toxicological reference value. So when we're accounting for short-term high soil ingestion events, and by that I'm really referring to this pica event where you have a child who could in theory consume up to 5 grams of soil per day. And that's, you kind of, to contextualize that, like what we tend to do in Canada is we use the 80 milligrams per day. That's kind of a chronic ongoing soil ingestion rate that we use for human health risk assessments. In Alberta, Health Canada uses the same value. So that's significantly less than what you would see for pica soil ingestion rate. Now, some people would argue that pica is really an unusual event. You don't see it very often. They tend not to assess it as part of a contaminated site. But there's mention of it in Alberta guidance. So it is worth looking at. And then assuming a body weight for a toddler of 16.5 kilograms. So if you go to the next slide, and I'd like to focus on cadmium and zinc as an example. So the first question that you want to ask, okay, if I'm looking at short-term exposure, what kind of toxicological reference value should I use? And where do I find that? So what I've seen people do in the past, they tend to rely on information that's presented in the toxicological profiles from the Agency of Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR. They offer a series of intermediate TRVs. On air, sometimes they'll offer acute, like true acute short-term toxicological reference values. They refer to them as minimal risk levels, so MRLs. And if you dive into the tox profiles for cadmium and zinc, they present an intermediate, and Karen described what the intermediate duration was, but they have an intermediate MRL or TRV of 0.0005 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day for cadmium. For zinc, it's 0.3 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So, and if like a really astute reviewer will recognize that those intermediate values, these TRVs, are actually really close, if not equivalent to kind of chronic TRVs. But because they're labeled as being intermediate, I've seen risk assessors kind of use these before. So you can use this information then, the pica soil ingestion rate, and you can use the toddler body weight, you can back calculate a soil concentration that in theory should lead to an acceptable level of risk. So the TRV in that equation is the toxicological reference value, the BW is the body weight, you've got the ingestion rate for soil, the relative absorption factor on an oral basis, and then you also have a potential amortizing factor for the exposure term. Now, we don't do that when we look at the acute scenarios, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. So if you go to the next slide, Karen. So this then, if I run the math on this, and if I compare my soil quality guidelines from Alberta, which are based on chronic ongoing basis exposure, you see that the residential guideline for direct human soil contact for cadmium is 14 milligrams per kilogram. But if I run that same short-term event based on that TRV in a pica event, my soil quality guideline is actually lower. It's 1.65 milligram per kilogram. And for zinc, you see that the AEP guideline for direct human soil contact is 10,000 milligrams per kilogram. But then if I look at the short-term event, the guideline for that we land on 990 milligrams per kilogram. So our acute scenario results in soil quality guidelines that are tenfold lower than what we have for our chronic scenario. So what's the end result? Well, we know that we've overestimated or overstated risk. And that's probably likely due to an incorrect use of the TRVs, just kind of blindly accepting those ATSDR intermediate TRV values. So then you have to ask yourself, so what's the fix? How do we correct this? And if you go back and you look at some of the guidance that's offered by Health Canada, and it's not very clear, but they do state that the focus ought to be on compounds that are known to be acutely toxic. So zinc and probably cadmium aren't great examples of that. You'd really have to kind of reconsider your TRV selection process. So think about possibly looking at alternate sources. So instead of just automatically going to ATSDR, which does offer intermediate MRLs, think about going into the medical literature and look for acute poisoning episodes, because that might offer you some more relevant toxicity information. So the next example on the next slide is the incorrect application of dose averaging. Now we see this on a regular basis. If we look at a site, maybe a recreational or parkland area that isn't used frequently, and then we look at something like lead. So, and Health Canada is clear, and I've seen this before, where people assume, okay, let's say we've got a kid crossing this site, maybe one day a year. It's maybe a trail system. They don't go there very often, and they go on a hike with their family, so they're exposed for a single day. And then they adopt a chronic toxicological reference value, and then they make the amortization of exposure, where they multiply the exposure estimate by 1/365. But that's inappropriate. We know that's inappropriate. Health Canada is clear on this issue, and they don't allow for this kind of exposure amortization. So Health Canada says when you look at things like developmental toxicants, you can't make adjustments for weeks per year or for total number of years. So what you end up with is an underestimation of risk for this particular scenario. So again, I mean, possible fixes for something like this: maybe think about using a physiologically based pharmacokinetic modeling exercise where you look at blood lead spike or spikes in blood lead levels for children. But certainly amortizing like this, like for this type of example, it's inappropriate for a contaminant like lead for this type of site. So next slide, please. Another pitfall that we've recently seen is just adopting an unrealistic exposure scenario. And this is a scenario where contaminated soil, in theory, hypothetically, let's say you've got contaminated soil at depth, and then that contaminated soil is brought to surface and it's left there. And then you've got a child who's potentially exposed to that mound of contaminated dirt. And what would be the health impacts associated with that? So using dioxins and furans as an example, we know that dioxins and furans are a reproductive and developmental toxicant. What the assessors did is that they assumed a short-term TRV, so less than 24 hours. That TRV is based on a tolerable monthly intake level. And that tolerable monthly intake level comes from the World Health Organization. However, the World Health Organization is very clear, and they say that in view of the long half-lives of dioxins and furans, they've concluded that it's not appropriate to establish an acute reference dose for these compounds. So that's kind of the first pitfall, like the adopting a short-term TRV for this type of scenario. And when they ran the numbers, when they looked at the soil concentrations and they looked at a pica child, again, it called for immediate removal of that soil. So instead of using an approach like that, the focus should probably have been on a more realistic exposure scenario. And there should have been some caution with respect to amortizing exposure, because you are dealing with a reproductive and developmental toxicant. But the end result was that it ended up with erroneous risk estimates. And I know that I'm a little bit short on time, so maybe we can go to the next slide, Karen. And then finally, the two case studies that came out of the UK. This is a study that Kowalczyk et al. Came out with in 2013 from the Public Health Agency in the UK, and this is based on a couple of sites in and around the Manchester area. And they showed some examples where the acute risks may actually exceed the chronic risks. So the first example had to do with cyanide. This was an old gas manufacturing plant that was now being used for parkland purposes. So again, kids walking through the area on an irregular basis. And they adopted a toxicological reference values that was based on the lowest observed adverse effect level. And they were able to show that in isolated pockets of surface soil where the cyanide was, that the acute risks at time actually exceeded the chronic health risks. And they were able to show that the chronic health risks were low because they were able to use some statistical estimates of the cyanide concentrations across the site. But they recognized that there were hot spots. And the way that it turned out, these hot spots actually for cyanide, this free cyanide, they had bound to iron. And so you had these blue kind of like, these colorful spots that had come to surface that children might be drawn to. The other example is for chromium-6, and this is an old tannery site that was redeveloped as a school in the 1970s. Same kind of idea. This had been capped, but over time that cap had been eroded, and some of the contamination had come to surface. And we know that on an acute basis, on a short-term basis, that chromium can actually be a pretty potent skin sensitizing agent, so it could cause allergic contact dermatitis. And these fields were being used for contact sports, so rugby. So there was an opportunity for some enhanced skin loading, some dermal contact. And they actually landed on a soil quality guideline of 80 milligrams per kilogram. Now, recognizing that the Alberta Residential Parkland guideline for chromium is actually 220. So they ended up with a soil quality guideline on a short-term basis that's lower than our Alberta Residential Park guideline. So, I mean, some commonality between those sites. They were both infrequently used. And this is not something, so there's, that limited the opportunity for ongoing contact with the surface soils. Examples where you see acute risk exceeding chronic risk, that you're not going to see that at residential sites, because when you're looking at residential sites, you have to assume kind of ongoing continuous exposure. So these types of sites, these types of scenarios are quite unique. And I'm going to offer it back to Karen now.
Oh, just a couple quick closing slides. I think hopefully the message that we've got across is that the assessment of single, acute, short-term exposures, anything other than chronic really, is not straightforward. And you must give careful consideration to the chemicals and the exposure scenarios and really be quite pragmatic about it. Because the use of incorrect values or assumptions can result in the generation of erroneous risk estimates that might be over or under conservative. And it could result in the calculation of guidelines or remediation targets that aren't realistic. And the result to the site operators and owners, or landowner, or anyone who could be working on the site could be increased costs and increased liability. So some parting thoughts: just have a really clear understanding of what you're assessing with respect to duration of exposure, and also keep in mind the chemical specific information that's key in terms of understanding the potential for adverse effects and how that chemical may elicit its effects, because small differences can make a big change in the numbers that you're working with respect to risk estimates. And my parting question or thought is, are short-term risks being evaluated appropriately at your sites? And there's a few references for your information, and please feel free to reach out if you would like us to answer any questions.
Okay, so we actually don't have any time for questions, unfortunately. So we're going to move right along to our next presenter, which is Amy Gaynor with Advisian. And she'll be presenting on site-specific plant ecotoxicity of residual petroleum hydrocarbon fraction 3 in subarctic soils. So I'm going to switch over to Amy.
Hello. Is my screen sharing the
Yes.
presentation? Okay, it's on
Yep.
the presentation slide. Okay.
Yes, we see your desktop though, so you may want to.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Is that sharing presenter mode now?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
So you want to go to display settings. There you go.
And the swap. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Okay.
Enjoy.
All right. Thank you. So today I'm going to be presenting on kind of under the umbrella of risk assessment, as the previous presenters have mentioned. We have problem formulation, the exposure assessment, the toxicity assessment, and the risk characterization. So my presentation kind of falls underneath the toxicity assessment for how we kind of come up with toxicity reference values for the ecological direct soil contact pathway. So I just want to start off by mentioning I'm part of an amazing team here on this project with Sylvain Bordenov, Anne Gladiotis, who was kind of the godmother of this project, Elizabeth Hack from Ecometrics, and then as well as Linda Eastcott with Imperial Oil Limited. There's lots of people involved on this, so I just want to make sure they get their recognition, and also the previous contributors also. Now, to start off, I want to start off talking about northern challenges and why risk assessment is actually a great option for northern and remote sites. As we had heard uh, Jennifer earlier mentioned too about northern remote sites, how risk assessment is really good for these settings. So when it comes to remediation, northern remote locations is often limited by numerous factors, climate being the most obvious. It's a very shorter field season up there with colder temperatures that slows down degradation processes, as well as the remoteness. The remoteness is difficult in getting heavy machinery up there, as well as people, and definitely a lack of waste disposal facilities, all making it very expensive to do remediation work in the north. That being said, because of all this, often bioremediation is a good approach that is used up in the north. So I'm going to talk about, kind of go through the history of this and start with the project background. So this project is up in the Northwest Territories. It's technically subarctic in the Taiga Plains ecozone of Northwest Territories. So this is the Mackenzie River Delta area of Northwest Territories. So the project kind of started with, there was a lot of bioremediation going on of petroleum hydrocarbon impacted soils on site. They were using biocells, and there was about 5 years of treatment using, there was different fertilizers, surfactants added, different kind of treatment attempts. And there were some good stories up there. There were F2 was a degradation success. We'd seen F2 levels drop out. However, as happens on many bioremediation projects with heavier ends, the F3 degradation became stalled, and they weren't witnessing any more degradation over time. And the levels that they were stalled at were still exceeding the generic CCME guidelines. So the different kind of concentrations of F3 that they were seeing in the treatability range was between 2,500 and 500 milligram per kilogram. And as we know, these are above both fine and coarse grain material for industrial or the parkland guidelines for the area. And so F3 often gets held up. The exposure pathway that's limiting for F3 on these land uses is the ecological direct soil contact exposure pathway. And often the CCME guidelines really represent kind of a generic scenario, and it's really more so dominated by agricultural settings. So when we say agricultural, that's where we see the presence of earthworms. Earthworms are not found naturally in Northwest Territories or many boreal forest areas. And the guidelines are often dominated by agronomic species as opposed to boreal forest species. And although the F3 CCME guideline is representative of a weathered product, I believe it was about a year of weathering. So it was relatively minimal weathering. And there's lots of literature out there that shows for hydrocarbons that weathering is important in determining the ecotoxicity. So it was recognized that bioremediation was attempted, and that, however, rather than going down further remediation, the project wanted to challenge the toxicity reference values used for this guideline, and challenge it and try to make it more site specific for the north. And so that's kind of how the project started. So the original goal and objective was to develop site-specific remediation guidelines for the F3 petroleum hydrocarbons for ecological direct soil contact. And the goal was really to have this guideline to be protected of native plants as well as soil invertebrates that's found at the site that are representative of Taiga Plains ecozone. And the study also went one step further, and they used different climatic conditions that were more reflective of the taiga also, as opposed to the climatic conditions that are part of the standardized toxicity test protocols of Environment Canada or ISO or OECD. And so this was started about 10 years ago, and it was a big collaborative project at that time. There's industry partners, consultants, academics. Saskatchewan Research Council played a big role in the plans, as well as Environment Canada and climate change. So one of the first things that was conducted on this project was a soil fauna survey. They went out and they wanted to see at what rooting depths or what soil depths did we see invertebrates. This was really important for determining what surface soil would be the depth of a surface soil for the eco-soil contact guideline. And so they did a survey of sites with permafrost as well as no permafrost. And both of the different locations assessed had the same kind of theme, in that the top 20 centimeters had the majority of soil invertebrate populations. And obviously when it came to permafrost sites, this was even shallower. But on the non-permafrost sites, there was invertebrates observed till 3 meters. However, it was very minimal. The majority was definitely found in 20 centimeters. And then they also did classification of the invertebrates that were collected. And the invertebrates were dominated by Columbella and mite species, which is a really good story in that Environment Canada has a toxicity test protocol for Columbella, for a few Columbella species. And currently, I believe it's happening this year, Environment Canada is standardizing also a new test protocol for Ophiognytans, which is a Orobatid mite species. So it's really nice that we have standardized toxicity tests that match what we actually find in the field. So when they were doing these surveys, they were also checking the rooting depth. So similarly, on a permafrost site, the rooting depth was somewhat shallower, from about 0.3 to 0.5 meters was the maximum depths of roots. And then on non-permafrost sites, it went down deeper to about 0.7 to 1 meter. So it was really kind of identified that about a 1 meter depth seems appropriate for the ecological soil contact exposure pathway for this area. And so that was an interesting finding, considering that, well, in Alberta we use either 1.5 or 3 meter surface soil depth for ecological direct soil contact. So now on to more of the history with the plants. So the plant selection process for this project started with a literature search as well as a survey of the plants around the site. And so about 140 different species were identified initially. And then from that, many of these different species were determined for their suitability for ecotoxicity testing. And then the number of species was further reduced based on the seeds that could actually be acquired from the sites. And then the laboratory testing under northern climate conditions started, and only 10 species were identified at that stage. And then from there were 6 plant species that were actually used with the research project. And so these 6 plant species were tested in reference or background soils, and then also in the F3 contaminated soils. So the 6 species that were used were yarrow, black spruce, Bab's willow, green alder, slender wheatgrass, and balsam poplar. And now the number of test soils varied depending on the plant species. A big limiting factor in conducting toxicity testing from using site soils is you really need a large volume of soils. So often at the start of the project, you have lots of soils, and then by the end of it, you run out of soil. So that's kind of why we have the discrepancy in the number of test soils tested here. So now getting straight to some of the results. So all the results essentially told the same story, that across all 6 plant species, there was no toxicity observed between the uncontaminated background locations and the contaminated samples. So this is referred to as a NOEC, a no observed effects concentration. And so you can see that the different concentrations that we observed NOEC on depended on which test soils were used. So yarrow and black spruce, because there was more soils used with them, there was a wider range in test concentrations, but there was no toxicity observed between 1600 and almost 6000 milligram per kilogram F3. Whereas at the remaining 4, they were only tested in one soil, contaminated soil, that reflected 1600 milligram per kilogram. So what's really interesting about these results is how these results all show non-toxic effects at values higher than both the coarse or fine-grained F3 guidelines for, say, for a parkland land use. It really shows that although these, the F3, the parkland guidelines allow for about 25% toxicity across the population, there is allowances for partial toxic effects with parkland guidelines. However, what our results are showing is that even at the lowest concentration, 600 milligram per kilogram, we are showing no toxic effects. So our data really does suggest that there is that the guidelines are overly conservative. So the next step on the project is there are students, grad students doing research on the soil invertebrate toxicity with Columbella and mites using field soils from the site. And there's also an aspect of using solid phase micro extraction with the test soils also. So an alternative way to try and assess what is the available F3 to invertebrates. And that'll help us understand why we're seeing the lack of toxicity and the root cause of that. And then after we get the soil invertebrate results in, we're going to be tasked with a more challenging task, which is how do you set a guideline if all the results are NOECs. We don't have all the soil invertebrate results in yet, but there is a good chance, or we anticipate, that the story might stay the same and we might continue to get NOECs. So we are exploring many different options in how to determine a guideline with NOECs. What I've on the screen here is just the general description of how guidelines are determined for agricultural and parkland land uses. And they really prefer using an SSD to determine a guideline. However, SSD are built using partial toxicity effects data. And there's really not any clear guidance on how to use NOEC, how to determine a guideline just with NOECs and no partial effects. So we are engaging different regulators and Environment Canada personnel on different approaches that we could potentially use for the future directions. And hopefully that'll be another future presentation from us, the results of the next 2 steps. And once again, I just want to acknowledge it's a really collaborative team that's working on this project, and yeah, just a lot of different players and team members on this. And at this point, I'll take some questions.
Okay, so I don't see any questions, any further questions. I see some raised hands. Okay. Oh, we have a question from the previous one. I'll have to get that to the presenter. But it looks like we don't have any questions for this particular presenter. So with that, I think we are, next up is a break. So we should reconvene at 3:10. So I will let Amy off the hook since there's no questions here, and we'll see you guys in about 25 minutes. Hello, everyone. It looks like we're all back. It's 3:10 and time for our next presentation. So we have Amanda Freer from Matrix Solutions, and she's going to talk about a risk-based approach to contaminated site remediation and liability reduction. Amanda, are you?
Thank you, Sheila. I'm ready.
Perfect.
I don't think I'm a presenter yet because I don't see
No,
that option.
I will make you.
Are you seeing the slide
I
view?
am seeing. I'm seeing your presenter. There you go. Yeah.
Okay,
Go
and
display
that view is
settings.
correct?
Nope. If you go to display settings, we're seeing your notes. There you
Okay,
go.
there we go.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay,
Good luck.
thank you. Thanks, Sheila. So yeah, as Sheila mentioned, I'm going to talk about risk-based approach to contaminated site remediation and liability reduction. So I'm going to discuss the benefits of applying risk-based approaches to contaminated sites. I'll go over how risk-based approaches fit into the existing regulatory frameworks in Western Canada, and then I'll get into 3 case studies that illustrate the application of risk-based approaches to remediation and liability reduction. So I'm sure I don't need to tell you that the oil and gas industry has changed substantially since 2014. Oil and gas producers have identified reduction of environmental liability as a high priority, but ongoing capital constraints has increased the need for cost savings. Risk-based approaches to site management or remediation can result in substantial cost savings versus remediation to generic Tier 1 guidelines. So we saw the contaminant receptor exposure pathway Venn diagram from one of the earlier talks in this session. And as mentioned, each of these 3 elements must be present for environmental risk to exist. Oops, my slide wasn't quite right. For example, if you have a contaminant and an exposure pathway, but there is no receptor, then there is no risk. So this relationship makes it possible to leave contaminants in place with no risk to receptors, where there's either no receptor or no exposure pathway present. The conceptual site model tells us the relationship between the contaminants or sources, receptors, and the exposure pathways for each site. So the foundation of risk assessment is the conceptual site model. It's built based on available site-specific and regional publicly available information to develop a preliminary understanding of the risk to receptors for a given site. Once we develop the conceptual site model, we typically use numerical modeling to test our conceptual site model, which serves to build confidence in our understanding of the site, predict future contaminant migration, evaluate remedial options if needed to protect receptors, and provide an assessment of confidence in the proposed remedial approach. So this risk-based workflow leads to informed decision-making for a given site and helps support monitoring or data collection plans that enable us to refine the conceptual site model. So this diagram illustrates the process of evaluating the risk that a given contaminant can have to receptors if we also have an exposure pathway. So first we establish that there is a hazard, that this chemical or contaminant could cause an adverse effect on the receptor. Then we use toxicity assessments and exposure assessments to determine how this chemical affects receptors and what dose the receptor is likely to be exposed to based on the concentrations that we have at the site. This allows us to characterize the degree of risk for the site. For example, if the exposure assessment indicates that contaminant concentrations that the receptor will be exposed to will remain below those relevant toxicity thresholds, then that risk to the receptor is low. So how does risk assessment fit into the contaminated sites regulatory framework? This example is the Alberta framework, where there are 2 management options to achieve regulatory closure at your site, and they are Tier 1 or Tier 2. So Tier 1 is meeting the generic criteria that have been developed for a given land use, which assumes that all receptors and exposure pathways are valid. Tier 1 incorporates some fairly conservative assumptions so that these guidelines are protective of the vast majority of sites. Tier 2 involves using your conceptual site model and applying simple pathway exclusion or using your site data to modify the generic guidelines to eliminate some of your assumptions that might be overly conservative for your site or modify those assumptions. Tier 2 also has the option of a site-specific risk assessment, which can further eliminate the conservative assumptions built into the generic criteria and provide a more site-specific evaluation of the risk at a given site. So although the names are a little different from province to province, each of the 4 Western provinces uses site-specific risk assessment to address situations outside of the parameters set for generic criteria. Each of these provinces also provides the option for regulatory closure through site-specific risk assessment. So on to the case studies. The first site is Site A, and it's a remote well site. So this site is a remote well site located within a natural area land use. The lease is located in a flat-lying, poorly drained wetland, and the surrounding vegetation is primarily sedge. For the boreholes that they drilled on site, approximately 30 to 60 centimeters of peat was encountered, so showing that it is located within a peatland area. And one of the most prominent site setting features is a major river located approximately 500 meters west of the site. So one other thing to note is the site is also located within a woodland caribou management zone, so it's quite an ecologically sensitive area. As far as the release details, this was a produced water release that occurred in the winter of 2011. And the initial cleanup consisted of removing ice and free fluid from the spill area and the first couple centimeters of soil that wasn't frozen at the time. So quite a bit of environmental work was also conducted at the site. They did EM surveys in 2012 and again in 2018. And you can see the 2018 survey here on the left. And then between 2012 and 2019, 32 boreholes were drilled at the site, and 16 of these were completed as monitoring wells. So on the right, we have the groundwater chloride contour map, and we have the 1,000 milligram per liter groundwater contour that's sort of in the center of the site, mostly confined to the lease area, and a maximum groundwater chloride concentration in 2019 of about 7,000 milligrams per liter. And this was down from the maximum concentration measured in 2014 of 10,000 milligrams per liter. So we also have groundwater flow maps that we created for the site. So we measured groundwater flow in September of 2018 and again in May of 2019. So one thing to note is that in September of 2018, we show groundwater flow sort of to the west-southwest across the site. But in May 2019, we have groundwater flow sort of going to the east on the western part of the site and actually going north on the southern part of the site. And the gradient is quite flat across the site itself. So this could potentially show that there's maybe some seasonal variation in groundwater flow direction at the site that we don't fully understand at this time. But for the purposes of a screening level site-specific risk assessment, which is what we were interested in doing, we're going to conservatively assume that the flow is going to be always directed west towards the river, which was the receptor of concern. So this is a west-east cross-section from the river to the site. You can see that there are sandy alluvial deposits mapped in the area associated with the river. And then the remaining underlying deposits consist of clay till. And then we also have shale bedrock that's present relatively shallow underlying the site. And through the regional geologic mapping that was available for the area, we did not identify a deeper domestic use aquifer. So this cross-section is along the same west-east line as the previous one, but it's more focused on the site so that we can see the detail in the interpolated chloride plume that we developed for the site. So this was generated in 3D using all the soil and groundwater chloride concentration data that we collected for the site. So it was a total of 101 soil samples and 16 groundwater samples. And we can see from the section that the plume is mainly contained, again, laterally to the lease, and that we have pretty good vertical delineation of the chloride impacts to the maximum depth of drilling down at 12 meters below ground surface. So a numerical model of groundwater flow and chloride transport was constructed and calibrated for the site. The 3D chloride distribution that we developed was used as the initial condition for the transport simulation. And for the groundwater flow direction, again, we just assumed constant flow to the west towards the river. So for the results, here we have the simulated groundwater chloride concentration distribution at about 200 years after the beginning of the simulation. And you can see that the plume does reach the river, and there's a very narrow band just here along a 24-meter section of the reach immediately adjacent to the river that we're predicting shallow groundwater chloride concentrations could exceed that freshwater aquatic life criteria value of 120 just along this very narrow section. So these discharging concentrations would be diluted by water in the river itself. It's a fairly major river that's there all the time, and it's likely that concentrations in the river itself would be much less than that 120 milligram per liter threshold. So based on the risk assessment, we have a low predicted risk to freshwater aquatic life in the river, but we do have these remaining impacts to the root zone. So due to the sensitive nature of this site, again, it's located within a peatland and also the caribou habitat zone, we're recommending doing a vegetation health assessment to assess the risk to the vegetation rather than going ahead with any root zone excavation. just to determine the health of that community. And so this approach is consistent with the Alberta reclamation criteria for well sites for peatlands, where you want to address the health of the ecosystem instead of, potentially excavating something that's not going to recover on any kind of time scale. And then, even if we are, so if we compare this, root zone excavation volume, the amount of impacts in the root zone is just under 16,000 cubes. Compare that to the 76,000 meter cubes of soil if we did do a full excavation to meet Tier 1 criteria. So even if we end up doing that root zone excavation, it's still only about 20% of the volume of the full Tier 1 excavation. So our next case study is Site B. It's a pipeline release. So this site has several overlapping historical produced water releases that occurred between 2000 and 2015. And as you can see, the site is located near a large lake to the northwest, and the surrounding land use is natural area. So initial spill response consisted of fluid recovery, about 16,000 cubes, and local hotspot soil excavation that amounted to about 13,000 tons of soil. Other remediation activities included installation of a series of containment berms and 1 to 1.5 meter deep trenches and boreholes to control and collect that surface water runoff before it reached the lake. And these are some of the linear features that you can see on the aerial photograph here. So a lot of work, again, was done to put together a very robust conceptual site model for the site. There's 18 boreholes and 30 monitoring wells at the site. And we put together detailed local and regional cross sections to understand the hydrostratigraphy, the shallow and deeper regional flow systems, and the distribution of chloride in the subsurface. So one thing to note is we couldn't install any monitoring wells or boreholes right near the lakeshore because this area was deemed to be ecologically sensitive, and this did somewhat limit our understanding of the downgrading impacts. So you can see on this cross-section, the shallow lithology consists of a glaciolacustrine silton clay up to about 5 meters thick, overlying a deeper clay till, and shallow groundwater flow is interpreted to be towards the lake. As far as the deeper hydrostratigraphy, all water wells within 2 kilometers of the site were listed as being used for industrial purposes and are completed in deeper aquifers, and there were no known shallow domestic use wells in the area. So again, we did a 3D chloride plume interpolation. So this is plan view of the groundwater chloride concentrations. Both soil and groundwater chloride concentrations were used to develop this 3D model. One thing to note, this is a relatively large spill area. It's about 1 kilometer long by about 500 meters wide. And then if you just want to take a note of the red dotted line along this section, because that's the line along which this section was created, just to illustrate the chloride concentrations at depth. So you can see from this, the chloride impacts are mainly limited to that upper glaciolacustrine silton clay. There is a deep domestic use aquifer located about 80 meters below ground surface underlying that till package, but there are upward vertical gradients between that deep DUA and the shallow groundwater. So because of this, that deeper DUA is not a shallow groundwater receptor. So again, a groundwater flow and mass transport numerical model was constructed and calibrated, and the goal was to evaluate the risk to freshwater aquatic life in the lake due to the remaining chloride impacts. And so we went ahead and simulated the base case, which is no further remediation. And then other remediation scenarios were also evaluated, which consisted of soil excavation of hotspots, and then groundwater recovery via trenches in various different areas at various rates. So these are the breakthrough curves generated using the numerical model for chloride concentrations within the superficial sediments, sort of discharging to the lake along the lake shore. So base case is this blue dashed line, which is no further remediation at the site. We're predicting a peak concentration of just over 300 milligrams per liter within the nearshore area of the lake in approximately 10 to 15 years. So we had the 7 other remediation scenarios that were simulated for various soil excavation areas and just different groundwater recovery scenarios. And when you compare the peak concentrations discharging at the lake, the differences are actually not that large for most of the scenarios, except for that light blue line way at the bottom, and that's excavation of all soil with equivalent to pore water concentrations greater than 1,000 milligrams per liter. And this is a volume of almost 170,000 meters cubed of soil, so a very large soil excavation. And then scenario C2B, which is this light pink line at the bottom as well, and that's groundwater recovery from quite a few trenches at a pretty high cumulative rate of about 100 meters cubed per day, so pretty aggressive groundwater removal. So you can use the remediation scenario simulation to generate a cost-benefit analysis, which illustrates the relative decrease in chloride concentrations at receptors given the remediation scenario that you're simulating. You can also go ahead and incorporate site-specific dollar values into this type of analysis to show the balance between contaminant concentrations and the economic and environmental costs to remediate, as previous presentations in this session also discussed. So this type of cost-benefit analysis can help in remediation system decision-making and can also be used to support discussions regarding remediation strategies with regulators and stakeholders. So for this site in particular, you can see the incremental decrease in chloride concentrations at the lake is pretty small when you compare the base case, basically no further remediation with the other remediation scenarios. And even if you do the most aggressive remediation scenario, the incremental decrease in chloride concentrations at the receptor is only about 200 milligrams per liter. So further assessment was done, including vegetation and aquatic life assessments along the spill path, and it showed that the biological receptors were not impacted, and also that future risk to these receptors is negligible related to the historical releases. So active remediation is not recommended going forward, given the low risk to receptors that was found to exist. And a new risk management plan is going to be developed based on the site-specific risk assessment. And it's going to consist of basically natural attenuation with a reduced monitoring schedule, just to confirm that we're continuing to not see adverse effects in the biological receptors. So when you look at the initial site-specific liability value for this site of $3.5 million, this is definitely going to be updated and reduced based on the cost to implement the updated RMP, and should go down substantially. So our last site is Site C. It's an abandoned satellite. This is a former Torque oil and gas satellite. So this site is much further down the road towards site closure and has also been used as a case study by the Saskatchewan Ministry of Energy and Resources. So the satellite was constructed in an agricultural area in the early 1960s, and it's currently abandoned. It's located on freehold agricultural land in southeastern Saskatchewan, and the site is cultivated, and there's numerous small wetlands in the area. And this kind of wetland topography is pretty typical of this part of Saskatchewan. So again, a lot of work was done to characterize soil and groundwater quality at the site between 2015 and 2017. There's almost 60,000 cubes of salinity impacted soil above the Tier 1 guidelines and also site-specific background values. They did find that there's upward shallow groundwater gradients present at the site. There was a tile drain recovery system installed at the site in 1990, but we still had a maximum groundwater chloride concentration of about 65,000 milligrams per liter in 2017, so still very elevated salinity concentrations on site. In 2015, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Energy and Resources assigned liability was almost $10 million. And at that point, Matrix became involved with the site and did another SSLA and came up with a value of $1.5 million if you just did a root zone dig and then operated the tile drain system for a number of years. And then, about $6 million if you were going to go ahead with a full Tier 1 excavation. So these are some site photos. You can see that there's some areas with reduced vegetation growth or bare areas on site. There is naturally high sodium sulfate soils in this area. So at times reduced vegetation can also be caused by the naturally occurring salinity. We did do a vegetation assessment at the site in July of 2019, and the results showed that 70% of the area, the impacted area, had acceptable growth, 15% was weeds, and there was about 15% bare areas. And they also concluded that the affected area was not comparable to the background area. So this tells us that we're likely seeing some effects related to the salinity impacts on site. So again, detailed site assessment and characterization. We did a lot of work on the conceptual site model development, including the chloride plume interpolation. We did a detailed numerical modeling was done to evaluate the risk to receptors, including a deep potable water aquifer, freshwater aquatic life in nearby wetlands, and also the root zone, and they used hydrous for that assessment. And again, as I mentioned, we did that vegetation assessment. So throughout the project, the landowner was very involved and updated throughout each phase of the assessment, and communication and understanding his concerns, objectives for the site was very important. And there was also a lot of communication with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Energy and Resources throughout this project. So this shows the plan view and cross-sectional view along this red dotted line, or the red line, of the 3D digital interpolated chloride plume that we developed using all the soil and groundwater quality data collected at the site. And then we also, again, developed, constructed and calibrated a numerical model of groundwater flow. So you can see the cross-section here is actually taken from the numerical model, and it shows the chloride distribution that we imported into the model, and also some hydraulic head contours as well. So the results of the site-specific risk assessment, we were able to eliminate the livestock watering and irrigation pathways due to unsuitable background groundwater quality. We also did numerical modeling simulations that showed very little lateral spread of chloride with no impacts to the freshwater aquatic life in adjacent wetlands. There just wasn't that spread toward those wetlands. And so we're really left with the root zone impacts at this site as well. One thing is we have those upward vertical gradients, and so the movement of chloride is mostly sort of up and down in the soil profile. And because of this, if we did go ahead and just do that root zone soil excavation, the value would be limited, as there'd always be potential to re-impact the clean stuff on top with impacts or the salinity that you're leaving down below. So the landowner's preference throughout this project is, he really didn't see the value in excavating and landfilling the root zone soil. And so the focus shifted to economic compensation, and this can include, stuff like reduced crop yield in impacted areas and or reduced land value at sale. Administrative controls are currently approved for this site and will be put in place shortly. So with this new strategy, the landowner is on board and the regulator is on board as well. So one interesting thing is that the site was one of the test sites used to update the acknowledgement of reclamation requirements, or Directive PNG 16. So this is sort of Saskatchewan's equivalent to a reclamation certificate. So sites are divided into routine or low risk and non-routine or higher risk sites. And for these non-routine sites, there's two options. So you can get risk-based site closure, and this is for salinity impacted sites where levels are greater than tier 1, but within the site-specific guidelines. Or you can end up with administrative controls, and these are for salinity impacted sites where levels are greater than tier 1 and the site-specific guidelines, but where additional remediation is shown to be unwarranted. So in summary, I used some case studies to illustrate risk-based approaches to evaluate and reduce the environmental liability associated with a given site, and each approach was very site-specific and based on the unique combination of contaminants, pathways, and receptors, and the conceptual site models that were developed. So there are often safety, technical, and financial limitations to contaminated site remediation, and risk-based approaches can be used to focus resources on sites that carry the greatest risk, identify the remedial strategy that manages or eliminates risk, but also maximizes the overall environmental, social, and economic benefits. And of course, continuing dialogue with regulators and stakeholders is very important. So one last thing I wanted to mention is I think the regulatory framework is really evolving. Alberta Environment and Parks has recently put out a draft site-specific risk assessment guidance document, and Saskatchewan is evolving their processes for non-routine reclamation or risk-based site closure. I think this indicates increasing regulatory appetite to consider risk-based closure. I think they're realizing that the consequences of not getting closure at sites include sites that sit unassessed and unremediated for years, and potentially end up in provincial orphan well funds, which nobody wants. So that is what I have. I don't know if there's any questions.
I will take a peek. It says, for Site C, are the administrative controls transferable if the landowner sells? Are they enforceable?
That's the idea. That's my understanding that that's the idea with the administrative controls, is that it does stay on the land. So the landowner would be able to sell and it would stay with the land going forward, yeah.
Okay. And did the vegetation assessment you conducted at Site C include plant tissue analysis? If that is the case, what were the plant sodium and chloride contents?
Yeah, so it did not include plant tissue analysis. It was really more of a visual assessment and comparison to a background location. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? I think that's it
Okay,
for
well, thank you very
questions.
much.
So we'll let Amanda go, and our next presenter is Simone Levy, and she will be at 3:40. So we'll take a 4-minute break, and I guess come back in 4 minutes. Okay, and while we have a couple minutes, I'll see if I can get Simone Levy from Initech. Simone, if you're standing by, we'll get your presentation loaded and make sure you have access to controlling our screens. Okay, everyone, it is 3:40. And so we'll continue on with our risk assessment and remediation technical session brought to you by North Shore. We're going to have Simone Levy from Inotech Alberta, and her topic will be a presentation on environmental release simulation and testing to inform hazard assessment and risk mitigation. Take it away, Simone.
I'm just trying to share my screen, Sheila.
Okay. Wonderful. We see your screen.
Do you see the slideshow?
Perfect. Yep, that's exactly in presentation mode. That's perfect.
Wonderful. Okay, well, great to be here with you today. So my name is Simone Levy. I'm a research scientist with Inotech Alberta in the Environmental Services Division. This talk came about based on some interesting projects that I was able to work on in the last couple of years. I want to thank clients that brought us the work. I won't be sharing names in the presentation just for confidentiality, but it's really been an interesting experience working on quite a diversity of things. So I guess it's allowed us to create some multidisciplinary teams within Inotech and with various collaborators, really trying to answer some research questions that I'll get into throughout the presentation in terms of the environmental simulation and why we're doing it. And I guess my takeaway from this is that I don't have all the answers, but I feel like I know who to ask. So hopefully you will appreciate that as I go through here. So Inotech Alberta is a wholly owned subsidiary of Alberta Innovates. We have an applied research focus. We're a research and technology organization. This experimental design approach for environmental simulation and testing looks at fate and transport, complex mixtures in the environment, and effects to various receptors. And I'm going to go through some examples and case studies related to land, air, and water, which, as you can guess, overlap quite a bit. So Inotech, what do we do? For those that are unfamiliar with the organization, technology research, development, and deployment, de-risking and pilot demonstration facilities. I'll talk a bit about analytical testing and monitoring, as well as some of the innovation and emerging technologies work that we try and integrate where possible. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm in the Environmental Services Division with the Environmental Impact team, and we focus on contaminant fate and behavior in the environment. And I'll be talking a little bit about scale. You hear me refer to scale several times. So micro scale, bench scale, meso scale, and field level investigations. We have recently merged with the former water group at Inotech. So that's been really great to have a little bit more water integration and focus in the work that we do. We de-risk technology and processes, and we support science-based policy recommendations. Some of the equipment that we have, or I guess facilities more so. So these are aquatic mesocosms. They're set up to simulate end pit lakes. Those are out at our Vegreville research farm. We also have a number of greenhouses. You can see here above ground mesocosms that hold about 5 cubes of either soil or liquid. And also some different kind of field scale. These are some of the soil columns that we have. So just to give a flavor for what kind of facilities we have access to when we're presented with some of these challenges. So experimental design process. So generally a client or a collaborator will come to us with either a novel product or wanting to get into validate some of the conceptual site model components that they have in mind. They may want to understand, true fate and transport of a complex mixture. And so what we start by doing is characterizing the product, if it is indeed a product that we're dealing with. So looking at physical and chemical characterization of that. And then really looking at this release scenario. So if it indeed is a release to the environment, or placement in the environment of a certain type of material. Really working with clients and collaborators to nail down, the scenario and the actual factors that will affect that fate and transport or degradation or behavior of whatever it is we're dealing with. And I know I'm generalizing a little bit, but I'm going to be talking about quite a number of different examples throughout the talk. So just trying to cover them off as best I can here in this design process. So looking at receiving environment. So this can be likened to the conceptual site model. Again, looking at that land use, human and environmental receptors. What are we trying to simulate so that we can answer our clients' questions, and how can we do that in the most realistic way possible, right? So dealing with land use, receptors, and then characteristics of that environment. So it might be soil type, it might be down to soil density, vegetation type, water type, etc. Again, coming back to that scale, so we have access to be able to do testing at micro, bench, meso, and field scale. Doesn't mean that each of these applies equally in every scenario. So sometimes we do some microcosm tests that will then feed into a mesoscale experiment or into a model or into a conceptual site model. So it's really sometimes choosing which scale makes the most sense in an experimental design. Refining the scope and design to meet needs and, of course, our friend budget. So oftentimes it would be ideal to test all different scenarios, but as you know, that can result in kind of exponential testing setup, and sometimes it's just not realistic. So really have to kind of hone in on what is the question that needs to be answered and how do we design to be able to answer that question or those questions. Conduct experiments in the testing program, look at results, see how they fit into the decision-making framework, and then conduct a gap analysis and additional testing if required. So we know and love the Alberta Tier 1 soil and groundwater remediation guidelines. The land uses that are defined here and the receptors associated with them provide a pretty good framework for a lot of the work that we do. So I just wanted to kind of bring that in as kind of one of the foundational pieces to what we're trying to do when we're setting up experiments. And just had to use this gorgeous photo from Golder to highlight that we generally work in conventional oil and gas, so dealing with all sorts of different sites and scenarios and facilities related to conventional, and then also up in the oil sands doing some of the kind of larger reclamation support, which presents some other unique challenges. So I'm going to start with this sort of land theme. You see the green banner is land. And at micro scale. So my colleague, Dr. Karen Budwill, runs these microcosms. So often they are run because you can really test a number of different variables and factors that affect microbial degradation of compounds in anaerobic or aerobic conditions. And you can just really easily replicate what you're doing and tightly control your treatments, so different temperatures, conditions, light, dark, etc. And she's recently worked on a frost treatment tailings risk assessment study looking at degradation of a diluent. So this is something that we're doing, looking at salt in at different depths, and this is really kind of a meso, almost field scale, with these big columns that will be eventually sliced open, looking at salt at different depths and how plant roots, specifically vegetation geared to Alberta or prevalent in Alberta, used in the experiment to see how plant roots will behave when they encounter those salts. And that, again, the results from this experiment will go to supporting risk management planning. So we have dealt now with several hydrophobic soils and folks looking to be able to place those in situ, wondering if they will take on water from the environment or if they will cause groundwater mounding and have geotechnical issues. So we've tied in a few different tests, and I'll get into this one and then another in a moment, and really looking at setting up experiments at bench scale in this case to determine whether these soils will take on water and how much they will release if they do. So some of the work that we did there. And then I just wanted to highlight, so we actually have an industrial CT scanner that we use in some cases, specifically for analyzing samples in a non-destructive way. So further to the work that I just mentioned with those little soil columns looking at the hydrophobicity, there's also a research question that came to us, you know, at field scale. Could we interbed these hydrophobic soils with a slurry, and would the moisture from the slurry then kind of overcome the hydrophobicity or distribute through those dry tailings, sorry, the hydrophobic soil? And so it did end up that there was some redistribution, but it wasn't complete. And so that was something that was used for placement planning of these soils. Another CT example, just because, you know, it just looks so nice. So this is a 2D look at product release to soil. We ran some tests on coarse and fine grained soil, and determining the question in this case was, in a cleanup of this of a spill of this material, would you be able to guide your equipment based on visual staining and impact? And so it was looking at what kind of penetration depth we got from the product on the surface, and also once that was removed, if there were any other parameters that had leached into the soil beneath it. So this project was done in 2014, and essentially this is a column. This is looking at a spill scenario, so a leak from a pipeline simulated here. So this bottom reservoir was where the leak would be introduced, and then there was a soil column, and then there was headspace that was monitored by a PID and also with periodic GC samples. And so this was plotted onto this this graph. So looking at the headspace concentrations, and then these concentrations, so we understood what the time frame was in terms of evolution of these headspace gases or VOCs into the headspace, and also what kind of concentration you would get. And then this was used for modeling, and at the end of the day, what they were trying to determine was at what height above a spill, at a pipeline leak, would you be able to detect VOCs to be able to identify monitoring technologies. So the other interesting thing about this one was that we used a TMVOC, which is a type of Tough2 model, a numerical model. And so we had the fluid injection, and this should actually be turned sideways to look more like what we have set up in the column. But you know, you'd have your pipeline, you'd have your fluid injection point, your porous medium set up in a grid that you could then model 3-phase throughout, and then this atmospheric boundary where you could then model where and which components would end up being able to potentially be monitored. And on a kind of similar project, looking at what happens in a trench. So we set up some experiments. The question that came to us was, what is the VOC component that would be released from a certain portion of soil in a trench scenario like this? So there are existing models for sort of how air behaves in a trench, and this was really to inform potential impact to workers in this situation. And so this little rectangle, what we ended up doing was setting up and developing a method whereby we could pack spiked soil into this glass petri dish at a designated density. And this is a Tedlar bag, so essentially it expands and contracts and maintains atmospheric pressure. So that was a bit of a unique design that was developed, and it also has this clamp, so we could put the petri dish with the spiked soil inside, suck all the air out, clamp it, suck all the air out, and then add a known volume of headspace, so you would know what kind of VOC evolution you'd get into that known headspace. monitor with PID, take the GC samples, and identify what kind of VOC concentrations you would get, and then plug those essentially into the model that that accompanies that trench scenario. So when I talked about, or I mentioned complex mixtures a few slides ago, it's really one of the tricks here is, especially if you have a mixture that has, you know, a variety of different volatile components, you can look at the mixture itself and you can analyze that mixture, but it isn't always indicative of what is going to be released into the atmosphere. And so that's sort of hit home here. So I created a distillate with a certain range of carbon compounds, which is the blue. And so this range, you know, within the distillate itself had a pretty good distribution of carbon compounds throughout. What we found when we did some of those volatilization experiments, like I showed with the Petri dish and the Tedlar bag, is that really, you know, there's a limited range that do evolve, and some kind of interesting concentration phenomena that happen when you reach steady state in that headspace. And different temperatures, we can do these tests, or we have done these tests, I guess, at different temperatures to simulate different conditions, different types of setups. I mentioned the Tedlar bag, but there are also some little 22 ml vials where you can adjust the headspace to product ratio. And again, another method that has been developed recently where it's more of a where you have more headspace compared to the product, and also with this piston setup, you get kind of more distribution, more surface area, so you can identify sort of where's the max, what's the maximum VOC concentration you're going to get in headspace, and what's a more realistic VOC concentration you're going to get into headspace. And that really comes back at the end of the day when a client or collaborator is trying to understand what is the worst case and what is the more realistic case. If you're trying to develop a risk management plan, for example, you kind of want both of those pieces of information so that you can more effectively communicate with stakeholders, understanding, you know, what could be a really bad situation and what could be a manageable situation, or how do we mitigate, for example, a higher VOC headspace situation. So getting into the water side of things, so hydrocarbon behavior in water, we get some pretty interesting stuff going on in terms of different products and how they behave. So we've done several of these, and this is probably the coolest one, sort of like a lava lamp. And then also we do collaborate with others as well. Up the road in Devon, we have CanMet Energy, and they have this wave tank. And so some testing has been done in collaboration with them, looking at what happened to various products when you do have those waves. And we actually created, it's not shown here, but an artificial shoreline to see kind of what happens, you know, when this product bumps up against, it was a rocky shoreline that we had. So soil leaching columns, fairly standard, but does allow, you know, if you think about a conceptual site model and really understanding as groundwater moves through a unit of soil, how if there are some residual or parameters of concern, how those end up moving with the groundwater. And in this case, it was 3 sequential events. So looking at parameters that would solubilize, the water was added and left for 1 week, and then drained, and that was done 3 times. So it's really understanding over those sort of flushing events, you know, whether some of these parameters that we're concerned with here would essentially get flushed out, or whether there'd be kind of an ongoing source. And then getting back to sort of the scale and some of the integration that we've done. In this case, it's the conceptual site model. There was some different bench and microscale work that was done to kind of inform processes that would happen at different in different regions or in different areas within the conceptual site model more specifically. And so that's really kind of how they can be tied together. So in conclusion, we have research questions and design based on challenges presented by industry consultants and government. Honing in on the research questions sometimes is one of the more challenging pieces, and really developing those scenarios to make sure that we understand what questions need to be answered and in how much detail and with how many variables. Experimental design process and kind of going through the process that I described earlier is really the key to effective simulation to inform the management, mitigation, or environmental guideline selection, or support for justification for a certain approach. Again, coming back to scale, you don't just have to pick one. If you do a bench scale experiment and feels like it might not be exactly reflective of the larger scenario, the information can be either moved up to a mesocosm or a mesoscale, or the data can be input into a numerical model to be able to scale to whatever is needed or desired. As I mentioned, that sort of, I don't want to say really worst case, but just understanding a maximum or an upset condition, for example, is really important. But I guess one of the learnings that I've taken away from this is just focusing on that upset condition and what may happen makes it difficult to then come back and say, but it's not actually, that's not reflective of the more common scenario. And so sometimes, we do want to understand both those situations. Incorporation of results, obviously, there's also a literature review component that is conducted to make sure that the experimentation does need to be done. But oftentimes, results can be incorporated with the results from other scales of project, and also with what's found in the literature. And I guess what we've found is just involving our key stakeholders, clients, collaborators, to understand exactly what kind of scenario needs to be simulated to answer the right questions is really important. And then bringing in multidisciplinary expertise or different experimental setup as required, we found to be really important. So again, it's been really, really interesting projects tying together, and looking forward to building out, I guess, our capacity in this area. So that's the end of the presentation. I've got a couple minutes if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, we do have a few minutes. I've checked the question panel, and there's nothing that's come up yet. So I'm not sure if there's any questions in the audience. Doesn't look like it. Okay, well, why don't we roll that North Shore video one more time? And in the meantime, I will we'll talk to the next presenter.
Thanks, Sheila. Hello?
Hey.
Oh my gosh.
Logan, can you mute her?
No,
Sure
perfect.
thing.
I did a presentation and you guys can do
Thanks.
it.
Awesome. You're the best. Hi, everyone. We're just about at oh, I'm down on my, sorry, on my schedule here. We will be starting again at 4:10, which is in 1 minute. So in the meantime, if I could get our next presenter, and that'll be Mayor Sakari with Agate. Let's get your presentation loaded up and we'll get you going at 4:10.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Let me see. I do not have that yet.
Okay, I think I have to put you sharing. Sorry, that was my bad.
It's okay.
Great. So as I mentioned, yeah, so I see your presentation. It's in PowerPoint format though, not the presentation mode. Perfect. That looks great. And I hear you 5 by 5. So it sounded good. So yeah, so it's 4:10, and so right back on schedule here in our risk assessment and remediation technical session. So we're going to be talking to Dr. Meir Sakari with Agate Laboratories, and his presentation is tailoring cleanup strategies based on the contaminant. And so take it away.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for the time. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to ESA and North Shore Environmental for the opportunity given to me to do this presentation. I'm here to present our finding on the selective release of contaminants into water body that triggered the idea of perhaps tailoring a cleanup strategy. But before I start, I would like to thank Simone for bringing the crowd to the mood of experimentals and lab work. This is really, really helpful. I feel this way I can easier present my data. And I would like also to acknowledge and appreciate my team, Nathan Scott, James McDonald, Lisa Neville, Ryan Stopp, and Jackson Bergman. They helped me in all the experiments and the lab works, and everything has been completed at Agate Laboratories. Let's in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to discuss why tailoring a cleanup strategy, why is important, and why we consider this, and what happened that we perform an experiment, how we get the hypothesis tested, and what was the questions and research questions, and what was the results, the things that we learned, and the results, how they relate to us, and how they give us some relevant information. Imagine an oil spill. If you haven't seen one with your eyes, perhaps you have watched on TVs, perhaps you call scenes that the thick, sticky, dark crudes on rocks of a seashore or on the body of a bird. Also, if you recall some videos and let's say scenarios showing that a little tiny sheen is over water. Are these two scenarios, like having the thick crude oil versus having a light sheen, are they basically the same? Are they affecting the environment the same? And once we remove one, does that mean the cleanup and removal has been completed, the environment is safe, to consider environment is healthy, or what are other risks and how we can come up with a better decision for decision makers? Well, first of all, we believe that there is a general agreement that these two scenarios of highly contaminated site with thick oil and sheen are not the same effect. When we talk about the effect of different types of oils and water and the receptors in receiving environments, we are talking about mostly about the chemistry. When we talk about chemistry, we talk about the abundance of chemicals in oil. We talk about the composition in oil and the composition in not only in oil, also in the water body. Now, all of these are triggering the idea of what will happen to that floating oil versus the oil is being gradually or suddenly penetrated into the water. And that will be the main discussion of today's presentation. And we talk about chemistry of oil, how well that oil can get mixed with water, and water beneath that little thick layer at the top, the floating layer. We're talking about solubility as well. We know there are several physical chemistry rules involved, but one is log KOW, which is the partitioning coefficient factor. In a simple way, when we talk about partitioning coefficient or KOW, we're talking about a number that being generated when someone is adding that crude oil into octanol versus adding in water. Therefore, when we have like a lower number, that means the, 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 the solution, the solubility into water will be higher. This is why benzene and toluene showing a lower log KOW versus other BTEXs compounds. And this is why, and this is how we define the solubility factor in very, very general term. With all these, I believe that the cleanup should be different from one type of oil versus another type of oil. In oil, there are over thousands of compounds. Just to go over this kind of hypothesis, there are thousands of compounds in oil. Some of these compounds are listed as compounds that require monitoring, and some may not. But what we have here are three categories of three groups of compounds in oil that require monitoring by the government bodies, consultants, and we always have to make sure our environment has within a certain level of these chemicals. These two groups of compounds, the first one at the left side of the screen, what you see is called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and in general they are known as PAHs. There are again thousands, but US EPA has listed 16 of them as a priority pollutants. There is general understanding and different categories of different definitions of lower molecular weight of PAHs versus higher molecular weight. For 2 to 4 benzene rings, when they are fused together, they are making the lower molecular weight. When they are 5 to 7, they are making the higher molecular weight. In the middle, you have F1 to F4, which is highly being used in assessment of a contaminated site. But in general, they are not that much carcinogen as PAHs and BTEXs are, but they are priority pollutants. I mean, they are pollutants that we need to consider. When we talk about F1 to F4, we are talking about group of hydrocarbons, straight chain, and they are saturated, ranging from C6 to C10, known as F1. F2 is C10 to C16. Then we have F3, which is C16 to C34. And the last group, which is F4, that goes all the way from C34 to C50. At the right side of this slide, you see the third group of chemicals in the oil that we are going to use in this study, and to study them basically in this research are called BTEX. In general, they are benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. And this is FYI that the last group, the xylenes, they are consist of three groups of ortho, meta, and para. Wherever we talk about these compounds like xylenes, we are talking about a group of them, means all of them. Here are questions or research questions that ideally we wanted to answer them at the end of this research. If I could check mark them at the conclusion slide, I should be able to consider the objectives are completed or are met. What are those that I would like here to highlight quickly? Does the chemistry of oil affect the release of chemicals? Would the abundance of chemicals in oil be reflected in water? Does the time of exposure really play an important role, and how? Is the cleanup is the only step we take, and after that we can call the environment clean? And what other odds or mysteries might be happening here? That interestingly in this research we found some of those questions, extra questions, that triggered the idea of going further and doing more research. Just to show you how to answer the research question, series of experiments were designed and completed. We took fresh water. The reason we took fresh water here, because we wanted to simulate the situation that Alberta facing right now, is because we are abundant of lakes and lake environment, aquatic environment, not much into that marine environment. Freshwater was selected to simulate the lake environment of Alberta. In this research, 150 grams of water was placed in a pre-clean jar, EPA clean jar, but then 10 grams of crude oil was added to. Now, two types of crude oil were selected. Each time when we say we add crude oil to the top of the water, we just use one type of oil. We never mix two different types of crude oils. And then we left them on time intervals of 6 hours, 24 hours, and 192 hours. And at all time, we made sure that we have a blank accompanying the rest of the experiments. The bottom layer of that jar was collected. And the reason that I'm emphasizing in this here, just to show you this is solely a lab-based experiment, we eliminated the environmental factor that ideally in a larger scale, we wanted to test those as well. But at this stage, we just wanted to see how chemicals from the oil react with water. And the target compounds that I discussed earlier and I showed in previous slide, that will be BTEX, F1 to F4, and PAHs. The sample, the collected sample beneath that crude oil layer was, we did actually liquid extraction, and a portion of that extract moved to the GC. We use GC, FID, and MS based on the target compounds, and we got the results. But before we start this experiment, we wanted to see what type of oil we are dealing with. Basically, the crude oil, we named them as A and B. A represents the light crude oil, and B represents the heavy crude oil. Now, as you see here, the viscosity and the density of these two different types of oil are different. And what's happening here is that the viscosity for the lighter crude oil is around 11 square meter per second, versus what we have in heavier one is 991. For the density, we measured that as 0.85 for the lighter versus 0.95 of the gram per cubic centimeter for the heavier crude oil. Now, here I'm going to present you the first set of data. What you see here, the left side, you see light oil is highlighted at the top, and the right side, I have the heavy oil. The results are solely based on the BTEX results, and not F1, F4, not PAHs on this. This is solely BTEX. As you see, the breakdown of BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and total xylenes at the left side, versus the time frame of 624, 192 hours, which is 8 hours. The reportable detection limit has been highlighted at the far right of each, or right column of each table. Now, what here is interesting, the results, first of all, the results are presented at microgram per liter. Just imagine the low level, but you see in general, the light crude oil is showing more release between the hours of 24 hours and 192 hours, which is 8 days, mostly for benzene and toluene. But here is the same data, but is a graphical presentation of the data. Before I go to the data and explain, to the graph and explain, please note that from here, where there is a downward pattern, let's say you are seeing a higher concentration somewhere, I don't say when, but either you see that 6 hours or see 24 hours, and right after you see a downward trend, you see a decreasing concentration. That should, you please need to keep that in mind, that would be the main discussion of our presentation today. Now, the contaminants are not going anywhere. Just imagine the frame that I showed you. This is a totally experimental. It's a jar, and the environment is fully controlled. It's not a real environment to see contaminants has gone away somewhere else. But what we see here is contaminants are not going anywhere. They are staying at the bottom of that jar. Any increase makes a clear sense because the time led the chemicals release more into the water body versus a decrease raise the question why and where those chemicals are going. Again, what you see here in this presentation, in this slide, the left side, which is again for the light oil, right side, the heavy oil, you see we are having an increasing trend from 6 hours to 24 hours and all the way to 192 hours. I just basically made a little bit longer between 24 to 192 hours just to give you the feeling of, yeah, this time intervals are not the same, but again, this presentation is not exact, justifying exact timing, but yeah, but just want to show you that there is a distance between 24 hours to 192 hours. In general, you see that BTEX being released to the body of water from the floating oil in light oil is way higher versus in the heavy oil. But what you see here is that you have, for the heavy oil, we have a mostly decreasing trend from 24 hours all the way to 192 hours. Let's move to the next slide. What you see here is the same set of data, is a different set of data, sorry, but it's the same manner has been presented here. This is F1 to F4 with their carbon range of this straight chain hydrocarbon. Again, 6 hours, 24 hours, 192 hours. But here at the far right column of each table, we also presented the concentration of that alkanes into original oil. Again, I wanted to highlight that the results are presented at a milligram per liter. Here, we are taking a higher scale, because the concentration is very high. I just don't want you guys to see all those numbers with thousands and zeros. What we see here is that the original oil, a small portion of the original oil is being released to the body of the receiving water, like the body of water beneath the crude oil. Here is another graphical presentation or graphical view of F1 to F4. What you see here for the lighter oil, we see an increasing trend towards the first 24 hours being released rapidly, but then showing a decrease, versus in heavier oil, we see an initial decrease, like the first 6 hours, the chemicals, these alkanes are being released to the water body, but then is being decreased. That this is another question I actually wanted you guys to take a note on this one when we go to the conclusion and discussion. The next set of data belongs actually to PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbon. This is the last batch of data, which is about PAHs. Just again, reminding you that the far left column showing the parameters, that they are all PAHs, slightly more than those 16 PAHs of the US EPA, but then for the almost half of the column from top, what you see is the lower molecular weight versus the other half as mostly like all high molecular weight PAHs. But then the first part of the column showing the light oil, and you again see the concentration of light oil right here, concentration of PAHs in light oil, in original light oil, versus what we have in different time intervals. Now here at the right side, if you see the cursor, at the right side, we see the heavy oil and the concentration of PAHs all the way from lower to higher molecular weight in this column versus their concentrations in water. But in general, what we wanted to highlight here is that naphthalene and its alkylated compounds are very abundant in both oils, not only in light oil, also in the heavier oil. And also both oils showing again the release of a lower molecular weight PAHs way more than the higher molecular weight PAHs. And we know these are not an exception, because those concentration of higher molecular weight is really, really low, even in even the original oil. But heavy oil is slightly releasing more of the higher molecular weight PAHs to the water in different time intervals when we comparing to the lighter crude. This is the graphical presentation of the same set of data about pHs. Again, microgram per liter is the concentration we are talking now. What I would like here to show you, to highlight, is that for the lighter crude oil, we see an increasing trend and decreasing trend, and the highest concentration happen in 24 hours. And then what we see for the heavier crude oil is that the decrease and later on an increase in towards the 192 hours. In general, lighter oil releases more PAHs. Now, what does this say? What does it say? Water exposed to oil receives chemicals with relative abundance in the source, which makes sense. Always in oil, we have higher F1, F4, then we have PAHs, and we have BTECs at the lowest. The same thing happening in the water body receiving. The water beneath the oil also the same way. F1, F4 is the highest concentration, PAHs are the middle, BTECs are lower. Now, the second observation we had, the release percentage of compounds are not the same way. Like if in alkane, if we have the release of 1% of its original oil into the water, for pHs, perhaps we are facing a very, very low number, like let's say from 1% it comes all the way down to 0.1%. Well, it makes sense where there is a higher push of release when the concentration is existed. Now, the release of benzene and toluene were higher, as we discussed, but that can be due to the solubility factor, the KOW that we discussed earlier, that causes more solubility of benzene and toluene to water. Heavier crude resist this is what we observed. Heavier crude resist the release of chemicals due to perhaps the kinematic viscosity and density to the water. But once we give time in the longer run, we can see those are being released more to the water as well. The next I would like to highlight here, the lighter oil releases more of the toxic PAHs versus the heavier crude releases more of those carcinogenic material. The chemistry of oil perhaps dictates the release pattern, like what we discussed in a previous slide, like higher concentration, higher release. But only the timing matter based on the viscosity and density. At the 24 hours, we should be able to define, when we see an oil spill, we should be able to define in 24 hours what is going on. Is this, and the type of oil for sure. They say this is the type of oil, this is heavier type of oil, or this is a lighter type of crude oil, and this is the first 20-hour presentation. What would be the next? That perhaps it gives us an idea of the way to deal with the spill, and they are not the same. Lake's environment, that was the focus of our research here. Lake's environment, due to its simplicity, the buoyancy factor, and the limited water exchange, it makes the removal and degradation more difficult. It's not easy to catch the oil once in top of water because of the buoyancy factor. It may start floating faster than what we have in the marine environment. Let's do a kind of quick conclusion here, is that this is what we try to simulate and try to kind of visualize it here to show what will happen. Here we have the layer of oil existed here, and here is what has been evaporated that we did not study in this research. Nothing has been measured in the air. And then beneath the crude oil layer, we have the emulsion layer that we did not study as well. What we studied was the oil layer as well as the water layer. And you see the selective release of different compounds staying in the water after a certain period of time. Now, if you remember the decreasing trend here, we are we always been the question why this is happening. Our experiment was lab-based again. A chemical that has been released to water has no way to disappear, has no way to be removed. The half-life of each of these chemicals individually was assessed, and they are within 8 days. We do not have really a big like a half-life of them. And the only place that these chemicals, those PAHs, showing a decreasing trend after an increasing trend, let's say F1, F4, BTEX, whatever else, they might be going to the emulsion layer when they belong to, because the bottom layer, wherever here, we collected and we tested. And what we haven't tested was the emulsion layer. That might be the layer that we should expect this reassociation of these chemicals back to the oil, reassociation of those chemicals back to certain layer of oil. Let's call it as the emulsion layer. If we include this finding, let's say if we include this finding in a cleanup strategy, should we consider tailoring it? Should we think of treating different oil spill differently? Perhaps we want to give time to certain type of chemicals to reassociate to its original type of contamination, let's say the original type of oil, giving them time, letting the chemicals get associated into the emulsion layer, and from there we can define and decide how to treat it. Or once we remove the top layer, perhaps more research should be conducted, just in case there are some other leftovers in the environment. Like it reminds me the presentation a scientist from Environment Canada did a couple of years ago, showing that the Exxon Valdez, the remaining chemicals from Exxon Valdez, all those PAHs, some BTEX still existed after almost 40 years of the incident in the water. Now, with this few examples of how we might be able to tailor that, I would like to end my presentation, and would be happy to take questions in case any of you guys may have, or you also can alternatively email me at zachary@agatlabs.com or give me a call or message. I would be more than happy to answer those. And now back to you, Sheila.
Hi, thanks. So I have checked the chat panel, and it doesn't appear that there are any questions coming through. I guess you have a few minutes, but basically we are at the end of the day for today. Thanks everyone for sticking with me. Thanks to North Shore for sponsoring this session. And yeah, there's still no questions up. So I think what I'll say is goodbye for today, and we'll see everyone here tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila.
Thanks, Logan, for helping me.
Hey, no problem at all. I hope everything went smooth as you imagined
Yeah,
it could.
I think so. Yeah, it was stressful being a moderator, but no, thanks very
I
much
can
for all the
imagine.
help.
Hey, no problem at all. So everything's been recorded.
Okay.
I believe my lead knows where they've all been put, so those will all be organized for you guys afterwards, so you can get
Okay.
your hands on that and stuff like that. I'm not sure if it'll be uploaded today or tomorrow or the next day. We end tomorrow though, so it'll probably be up tomorrow.
Okay. No, right on. All right. Well, maybe I'll see you when I present tomorrow if you're in the same if
Yeah,
you're
I'm going to
my
be doing a
helper.
lot of the same stuff. I probably will see you tomorrow.
You
Then,
might,
if
yeah,
not,
you
tomorrow, those
might.
guys are great too. You
Okay,
have a
right
great
on.
rest of your week.
Yeah, you too. Bye.